Welcome to the Audit and Risk Subcommittee meeting. Just the normal reminders of being live streamed, and use your microphones. Turn them off when you're finished. We welcome you all to this meeting, and we have full attendance, so no apologies. Welcome, Brian. Good to see a non-committee member here.
Actually, yes,
It's, at least we didn't get the "oh my goodness, I'm in the wrong meeting" response. Right, move forward to interests. And are there any changes to the interest register or any particular interests relating to items on this agenda? Thank you. We don't have a public forum, so we move to the confirmation of the minutes of the 11th of August. Are there any changes or corrections to those minutes? If not, would somebody move their representative record of the proceedings? Thank you, Mr. Murray. Do I have a seconder for that? Thank you, Councillor Edgar. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Chairperson's report. Given the nature of the meeting today, I don't have a formal chairperson's report. So we move to item 7. Just one of 2 items on the agenda today, and that's the draft annual report, which you have the report in the paper and also have the report as a separate attachment in your papers. Ms. Harrison? Ms. McDonald. I just saw Nikki, sorry. Ms. McDonald. Would you like to introduce the report, take us through any changes or updates to it before I open up for questions?
Yes, thank you through the chair. I think the report itself is fairly straightforward, so happy to just move to questions. I would just point out one correction on page 190 where we've got the wrong heading there, which should have been council controlled organisation, so we'll fix that. But obviously there are more changes to come. This will go through audit and there'll be some, updating and changing of text through that process.
Thank you. Just a question I usually ask with a draft. Are we getting any indication of the extent of possible changes? Are they likely to be sort of extensive since this report was drafted, or has there been any major changes in the potential alterations that could be made?
So through the chair, the only one I've been made aware of is that some of the additional costs that were incurred through COVID-19 on capital projects, they're saying should be expensed rather than capitalised. It's about $300,000, so not really material, but that's the only indication I've had, really. They're still doing a lot of their groundwork.
Thank you, Ms. Harrison. Councillor Edgar.
Yes, just further to that through you, Mr. Chair. Has there been any indication of any issues with any of our CCOs? Because, of course, that can also hold up our annual accounts. So any preliminary indication of any issues from any of those entities that may impact on us?
So through the chair, it'd be fair to say they're all quite delayed. And as you'll be aware from the Port Nelson AGM yesterday, there is a bit of delay in some of the audit work that's occurring, just to do with the extra kind of COVID processes. The airport, I'm aware, has an issue around a potential qualification because they haven't revalued their some of their land and infrastructure this year. So that is kicking around, and we're getting technical advice on whether or not that impacts each of the council's audit.
So we still expect all audits complete by 31 December, though?
Through the chair, yes.
Thank you very much.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes, through the chair, Mr. Tregurtha has just joined me and he has some updates around council-controlled organisations. If we could let him have a speak to the subcommittee.
Good morning, Chair and elected members and committee members. We're still waiting for the performance measures from two of the CCOs, that's Nelmac and Port Nelson. We don't have a date on that at this stage, but obviously we're following that through quite vigorously. We think there's still some auditing which has been done on those performance measures. We do have, however, the airport ones. Most were achieved. There were a number that weren't achieved. I can just sort of quickly brief you on those if you wish. Lost time injuries. There were 3 injuries there, and the target was nil. EBI TDA, EBITDA, was not achieved, and of course that's a result of COVID-19. Total revenues, of course, were affected as well, and of course passenger numbers, particularly with Jetstar's withdrawal from the regional market, which was at the end of December. So that was a full 6 months of Jetstar not being there. Their sustainability measures were met, so they had measures in energy use and reduction, and they were also undertaking a business case for alternative energy sources, and they undertook that work as well. The only other one of note to mention was their compliance was with the Civil Aviation Authority and their airport operator certificate. There was one minor finding there, and that was immediately resolved. Their noise management strategy was achieved, and that's quite an important measure, of course, for the airport.
Wrong button. Thank you, Mr. Trigger. So, any other questions, Mr. Murray?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through the Chair, look, just to follow up on Councillor Edgar's inquiry around the airport, given that the nature is a possible revaluation issue in the airport and it's a qualification situation, I would presume, that's a little bit concerning, not to understand the extent of that, and I would certainly be concerned, one, if there was a qualification on the airport accounts, and 2, if that impacted on our accounts in terms of a qualification issue and or delay. It feels a little bit deja vu-ish to me. So I'd just sort of like encourage everyone to make sure that that's all appropriately dealt with and correctly dealt with. Look, just a couple of questions arising. I'm hearing that we're on schedule for the audit process itself, because it's fantastic to see this draft at this point in time, and I think staff, finance and others all need to be congratulated for getting it to this point, given everything else that's going on. So well done. In our last minutes, we noted that we would sign the engagement letter with Audit New Zealand subject to satisfactory conclusion on the fees and the forward forecast, and I just would appreciate an update as to whether that's been achieved or not. As a fourth issue, I've got some minor edits, but what I won't cover off in the committee, I'll just talk with either Nikki or Nikki about those, because they are indeed minor. But the one thing I think we need to really have a bit more explanation about in the accounts is the matter that you've highlighted at item 5.7, and that's the financial prudence benchmarks does not meet the debt control benchmark. Now, it'll be what it is, but I just feel there needs to be a little bit more explanation in the annual report around this. Now, this features on page 124 of our agenda. And if you have a look on that page, you'll see that we're always in the green, i.e. benchmark met, and now all of a sudden we're 106%. Presumably, if we were under 100, we would be fine. But I don't actually know what that is, if that is the case, and or what the 6% might mean in real terms. And it's particularly weird, given that we meet the benchmark for debt servicing, and we're also well underneath our balanced our debt affordability benchmark. So we've got two sort of debt benchmarks where we're quids in, basically, by a long shot. Then all of a sudden we've got a breach, and it just doesn't sort of flow or make sense in terms of how or why that occurred. So the graphs in, we've got to have it in there, but I just would like to see a little bit more explanation if we can possibly put in there as to what this actually means. Because I don't think it really means a heck of a lot at the end of the day, but it just looks weird.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Ms. Harrison, would you like to respond?
So through the year, it is weird. This financial prudence benchmark, which I was actually involved in helping design, shouldn't be called a debt control benchmark. It should be called a financial assets less financial liabilities benchmark. So it actually includes revaluations, which, as you'll be aware, with interest rate swaps and things like that, move around quite substantially. And really, when I've looked at this, so when you have a look at 5.7, it doesn't actually reflect our debt at all. It reflects a mixture of financial assets and financial liabilities. And when I look at this in detail, really probably what's happened is that the actual budgeting of what our derivatives liability was probably too low, and so where the actuals come in at, which is a reflection of how the interest rates have dropped during the COVID period, there is quite a big gap there. And normally with this benchmark we'd be okay because our capital program, our actual true debt is substantially below what we had budgeted for, because of the capital program, but because of the delay in the divestment of the community housing portfolio, we're actually quite close on actual true net debt. So I'm not sure if that really helps or not, but I think actually the benchmark's not correctly titled, and there has been discussions around removing these benchmarks anyway.
Yes. So look, I appreciate that, because on the page before we talk about debt servicing benchmark, and then we all of a sudden we talk about debt control benchmark, and you'd assume that word debt is the same, but it's actually not in this context, which is probably why we need a bit more explanation in here if we can. And look, is this just picking out, is this a consolidated net debt benchmarking position, or is it council only?
Through the chair, it's just council only.
Okay, so yeah, so look, I think we just need more explanation, because if I'm confused about it, and everyone else probably is too, I wouldn't want to speak for everybody else, but yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Murray. Any further questions on that? Okay. Any other questions on this? I just have one relating to page 11, which relate to the top 4 priorities for that period. And, you know, they're 4 quite high level, quite distinct ones that I think will be of interest to the community. But I don't see a report against, I don't see anything reporting against each of those 4 as to how we're doing against our top 4 priorities as a sort of statement against each. So I was looking at this and thinking, how would I see from this report what has happened in the CBD and how has council lifted its performance? I think it'd be useful if there was just a half page or a paragraph on each of those, just to indicate where and how we're tracking on those priorities.
Thank you. That's a good point. We can certainly add that.
Thank you. I note that this is the only time really that this committee will see this report as such, because the process from here is that it goes through to council for sign-off sometime prior to the revised deadline of the 31st of December. So this is our sort of chance to comment on that. Are there any further comments or questions in relation to the draft annual report? Madam Mayor.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So just, I take it that we're going to update the bar graph that was referred to before, just to put some more explanation on that page. That's great. And obviously do some fleshing out of the priorities. And the training priorities, are they identified? If I may have missed those, my apologies. Are they identified in the document? They probably are. So through the chair, we could add that at the same time as we are adding something around the long-term plan priorities. So that would be following page 12, page 11, with page 12, the agenda 11 of the. So we've got the 4 priorities for 2018 to 28, and then we've got the training and priorities that have come through as part of the last annual plan. Yes, through the chair, we'd put them in that front section somewhere before page 16. We'll just work on what's the most logical order. Okay, Nikki, is there a reason they aren't there? Because it's, I guess from a governance perspective, one of the things I'm looking for is the purpose of setting the training and priorities was to direct the organisation's attention to those areas as areas of to focus on those areas, and the fact that they don't appear in the annual report doesn't fill me with confidence that the level of focus is actually is occurring. So through the chair, the commentary on what's happening in those areas is embedded within the activities. Just hasn't been pulled out at a high level because our focus is on reporting against that year in the long-term plan. So we've focused on the long-term plan goals, but it's absolutely appropriate to pull out that information in a consolidated way for the front of the report too, so we can add that. Okay, thank you. Please, Chair, just one sort of very general question. I was going back through some very old minutes, looking for a paper trail on some activities of council that go on over many years, and I came across a resolution from the time when Mr. Graham Thomas was the chair of the governance committee, and probably the chair, possibly the chair of the audit committee at that stage if we had one. And he and I were going to write to, well, he was going to write, I think, to Audit to comment on the value proposition of the annual report process and the number of hours that are involved in doing this. And absolutely, I think an annual report is valuable, but what is its value? So Nikki, how many hours are involved in sort of roughly getting this delivered? And from an officer perspective, looking at value for money and value to council and value to community, do you think the hours reflect the value? Well, through the chair, and Ms. Harrison might want to comment on this as well, but it does take an enormous number of staff hours in so many parts of council. I couldn't even put a number on it because it's not just finance, it's not just the team writing this, it's all of the activity managers and all of the business units that feed in some of the text about what's been happening. I mean, I think there's certainly a level of value, but the amount of detail and the type of document you have to produce, I think, it's not a good equation for us, especially when you look at how the community receives it. I mean, my impression, given the number of copies we're asked for or the questions we get from the community, is that it gets very little attention. There is a summary put out, of course, and that is probably the main way that the community interacts with it. So it's a very expensive way for the organisation to meet the requirement. Right. So, through Mr. Chair, has that matter been raised with Audit? I don't know whether, I'm not sure whether Councillor Thomas at the time's letter ever went, but I'm sure it would have, he would have done that. But is this, that was, you know, a decade ago, is this an issue that would be across the sector and a concern across the sector around the commitments required for this report? Has Solgum or anybody else taken this up?
Chief Executive, do you want to comment on that?
Look, it is a topic of conversation from time to time, usually this time of year, about the resources that's required in it. It's not unusual for a finance team, for example, to have one team that manages the reporting requirements and one does the management and planning requirements. And that's one of the issues that we'll be facing this year. So it is a big piece of work, and Ms. McDonald's quite right. The number of people that read it is is not large. I mean, we need to report. We need to report on our finances, on our KPIs, but to the depth and level we do sometimes is just, it just seems over the top. It really does. But I think that's more a case for what does the Act say rather than what audit is saying. I guess that's a question.
Through the chair, I think it's probably more the way audit interprets what is required to fulfil the requirements of the Act, and I think that's where a lot of the detail comes in.
All right, so maybe could I request, Mr. Chair, that can there be some conversation between CFOs across local government, please, just to test whether this is a there is a view that this is perhaps not delivering the methodology is not fit for purposes in terms of value for money and impact. It may be that we need to do more communicating at our end about what it is, but it sounds to me like the level of compliance is and the detail required is perhaps not matched to value. And I raise that particularly because we know that we just cannot sustain a model that is business as usual in a recovery process. And I think we've got to be looking at every avenue that we can to use our resources as wisely as we can to help our communities recover. And if we've got an organisation that is embedded in hundreds and hundreds of hours on a compliance exercise that isn't adding value, then I don't think that's appropriate in this circumstance. We have got to be absolutely focused on the things that will make a difference. And perhaps if I will certainly on my end of Local Government New Zealand take this up to Local Government New Zealand and test that out at National Council level, just to see if we between SOGM and Local Government New Zealand can have a meaningful discussion about with audit, given all the pressure that is also on audit to meet other timeframes. We all need to start making some smarter choices about what we're doing with our time, I think. It was good to reflect. I have to say, demonstrated the value of keeping good council records, though, that I could go back for 10 years.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you make a good point there as well, that it's probably not just a single approach from CFOs. I think it has to be a multi-pronged one. And at the risk of being anecdotal, I can say that during my time in the health sector, there was a rebellion, or should we say a reaction, to the burden of the planning requirement on the district annual plan and also on the report that came out, and that was successful in significantly reducing the burden of both of those documents. They still took place, they're still reported, and in fact, other than the benefit to the task, there seemed to be no negative reaction. There was no negative reaction at all. People still got the information they wanted. So it's a fight worth taking, I think. But it's not just one single group of people that's going to achieve it. It had to go through the ministerial level and everything else to get there. Thank you. Any further discussion or comment on the draft annual report, Mr. Murray?
Was there an update on the audit fees?
Ms. Harrison, do you have an update on the audit fees?
So through the chair, no, there is no update on the audit fees.
If there's no further discussion on that, would somebody move that the committee receive the draft annual report in its attachment? Thank you, Councillor Sanson. Thank you, Councillor Edgar. Is there any further discussion? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. We move to item 8, the Health and Safety Governance Charter Review. This is looking at the charter document itself. And welcome Malcolm Hughes to the table. Welcome, Malcolm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So we have the report and the draft charter. Would you take us through it and make any changes or comments that have arisen since the report was written?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there's no changes since the report was written. There is, however, some questions that have come up that I can address perhaps first. So one of them was around some of the documents that are referenced in the charter that aren't accessible. I'll make sure that those are provided to the members of the committee, and I have copies of the good guide for directors here that people can take away if they want. Another question was around representation on the Health and Safety Committee by someone from the governance from this table. And I'm not sure whether that was in regard to the governance role or as a representative for worker engagement in that role. So addressing the governance one first, though there would be some governance benefits, and it ultimately will be a decision for Nikki Harrison and the Chief Executive. It could also, because the committee is primarily operational and for worker engagement, it could limit or impact the way that the workers from across the organisation engage having a governance member there. And if it's around engagement with the people around the table or the elected members, there's probably better mechanisms to achieve that than having them on the committee, as my comments on that question. And the other question was around why isn't there monthly walk-arounds, health and safety walks for governance members? We don't have a target. It is in the governance due diligence plan on page 31 under the actions, attend workplace visits with a focus on health and safety matters. It is an ongoing issue, getting enough of those scheduled and providing those opportunities freely.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. You've covered off those points as you want to.
I've covered off those points, yeah, and it was Councillor Edgar that asked them, so she may wish to.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Edgar.
Yes, so yeah, just follow up. So in regards to the, thank you for the documents. Yeah, just in relation to the committee, I wasn't 100% sure what level the committee operated at. So if it's a purely operational one, but on some other boards, there's organisations, there's a sort of, more SLT, health and safety lead sort of committee, and often a governance member comes along to those. And I mean, I think it would just be good to have, again, on other organisations, they literally have a roster, a monthly roster, and the board members' names go down, and that's when you're doing your walk around. And if you can't make that one, you swap with someone else. It's sort of, yeah, that simple. And so I think it would be important to just sort of step up that awareness, governance awareness around health and safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Edgar. Did you want to respond to that anyway, Mr. Hughes?
Just one point, perhaps a suggestion that the Chief Executive and Ms Harrison might consider is the option of governance members attending the Health and Safety Committee meeting to see, from a governance perspective, to see how it operates and get that assurance that work engagement is occurring. Is just something for consideration here.
Mr. Murray.
Yes, look, I'd support that suggestion, because part of the due diligence of councillors or governors in an organisation is to actually be actively engaged in the process and see it working. So that would be most appropriate. And look, I'd follow it on, because it's a wee bit of an old chestnut of mine, that I would suggest that instead of waiting for councillors or governors to turn up at these things, schedule them in for them, actually make appointments and say, look, here's an opportunity, this is your sphere, can you attend this meeting? And we're having a look at health and safety, and your interaction with that would be appreciated. And then that way, that sort of gets it into people's diaries and on their radar. That would be very helpful, I'd suggest.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. I was going to pick up on that point as well, because in my experience, with the best of intention around this being seen as of benefit and being a possibility, the issue is inevitably in the system in terms of how do we know when they're on and what they're covering. So I think that suggestion has some appeal, Malcolm, in terms of the possibility or the invitation for members to attend the appropriate health and safety meetings. But we do need a system, and it's got to be a consistent system that advises us when those opportunities arise with sufficient notice that we can plan them into a normal attendance type diary. So if that's something that could be looked at, I think that would be useful and would address that. It's something that I think the committee would welcome. So if we could take that as an action, I think that would be useful to do. Are there any further questions on the charter? Madam Mayor?
I think through you, Mr. Chair. Malcolm, you commented on the challenges of actually setting up the sort of health and safety visits before. I'm not sure if that was in relation to elected members, being part of a health and safety process through one of our other documents, which looks at sort of 4 of those a year. Was that what you were referring to, or have I misunderstood?
Sorry, through the chair, can you repeat the question, please, Nick?
As part of the process and meeting our obligations for health and safety, elected members, I think, are meant to do try and attempt to do 4, health and safety, visits on site at somewhere during the course of a year. And I thought you'd made reference to that before, but it must have been something else. I must have misunderstood.
Through the chair, I may have made reference to that in the past. However, when I checked back, there is no particular objective for elected members. Before a year, or I think it's 2 a quarter, actually, it's 8 a year for SLT members. We hadn't actually set a target. And I think, it would probably be more normal for members of this committee to do more of that, because that is their responsibility, rather, as opposed to some other members, or that perhaps chairs of committees did them in their areas of focus. So to have a target across the board for everyone may not work, but that's not for me to decide.
Right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll have to go. I've got it very firmly in my mind that there was an expectation for elected members to undertake health and safety site visits, but obviously I'm going to have to go back and through those historical records that I'm quite good at looking at and find where that's got to and why it hasn't carried through.
Madam Mayor, I recall discussions around that topic as well. I don't recall there being any, as it were, documented requirement of a quantum or a requirement to do that, but I know it has happened. I know we have, Mr. Hughes has reported in his health and safety report about various governance visits to sites at times, but I don't know that it certainly hasn't been anything formalised, and I think it may be worth looking at that becoming a little bit more prominent and as a requirement on members.
Yes, that was in response to questions I made at the last audit and risk meeting, but yeah, there hasn't been anything formal.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Mr. Murray.
Well, perhaps the conversation, Mr. Peters, is if there's nothing formal, nothing obvious, should there be? And is this the opportunity to put something in there? And I don't for 1 minute want to suggest what's appropriate, but perhaps we'll ask Mr. Hughes, should we put something in and what's appropriate? Yeah, that's on the fly, isn't it, Mr. Hughes? Sorry about that. My apologies.
Through the chair, I'm happy to put something in there and report on performance against it, and I guess that will indeed drive the action to create a system to make it happen. As to what's appropriate, that's the it's a very hard question to answer. When you look at what we've been able to achieve in the past, it's probably closer to 2 visits a year at best. But if we want to aim for more, it's about finding that balance between what's realistic and what's the perfect, what's ideal. The more would be better, but we've got to realise that it is also a drain on resources for the organisation. Someone has to accompany these visits, someone has to arrange them.
So through the chair, look, I'd be happy with Mr. Hughes' suggestion of 2. That's the average between 4 and 0, 2, as a start point reviewable. And look, I'd like to think it's not a big drain on resources. I think it's just members of governance interacting with council's normal procedures. It's just an add-on to that. So I would hate to think that it's a specific special one-off just because someone from governance is attending. It's more they're part of the process as opposed to an addition to the process, and that would be most appropriate. So I'd be happy with 2.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. I don't know who had their hand up first, Councillor McGurk and then Councillor Edgar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things. Just looking at the induction material that were given in November last year, there was an expectation that it was visiting work sites with the focus on health and safety matters. There was a clear expectation from the elected members at that stage that happens, and also participate in health and safety workshops. So that was, the material was given to us in the induction last year. Just being, I know the Deputy Chair and I of Infrastructure went to the site visit up at Bishopdale about 3 weeks ago, so they'll be reported back. I think that's gone through. But I think for logistics, having a whole bunch of elected members turning up on a work site can be very disruptive. And I would limit it to probably 2 or 3 at a time, rather have a smaller numbers going to more frequent meetings, site visits, than large groups appearing on a site. So,
thank you, Councillor McGurk. Chief Executive.
Look, I just want to, there is value in those meetings and those site visits for councillors to understand the challenges of health and safety. But yeah, if we show up with a full council, then the first thing that has to happen is work has to stop, because those people aren't properly inducted, and that's counterproductive. But 1 or 2 at a time, that's far more manageable. And I think we have let that slip through COVID, and we'll have to get that reinstated again. But also, I think that attendance at the Health and Safety Committee probably also counts in that respect as well. And just from that point of view, I mean, this is a meeting of staff pretty well down in the organisation, and if there's an elected member there each time, my worry is that's going to suppress conversation. So maybe 1 time in 3 would have someone come along as an observer to make sure, understand what's going on. But one of the things is that's the ability for people to speak freely and frankly about health and safety, and for that message to be passed up to me in a way that's independent of the management structure, so that I get 2 bites at the cherry as to hear what's going on. So, yes, we can set up a roster where councillors can come on site visits and come to that committee. And if we can get each councillor out, say once a year to something, then I think that's starting to lift the game, because it's time consuming. Well, we do that at any rate, but we do it as part of our works, but it's getting a councillor along as well.
Thank you. Councillor Edgar.
Thank you. Yes, so just sort of coming back to my original intention. So, yeah, it's not a tour. It's not get a whole group of councillors on a bus for a tour. These are health and safety walkarounds as part of a process, as Mr. Murray was saying, that is already happening. And I mean, that is what, other boards do. And it's generally, you have a roster for the year, and this is who's doing it in January, this is who's doing it in Feb, March, April, May, etc. And that's what I mean. If someone can't do their February one, they could swap with someone else. So it's quite simple, and it's only 1 extra person comes as part of an existing process. So there should be 0 extra time required for staff to enable that to happen. And then just in relation to the committee, as I noted earlier, I wasn't sure what level that committee operated at, because some organisations have that broader organisational one and then have more of an SLT, health and safety manager one, and the sort of 1 governance person comes along to that. I'm that person on NMIT, for example. but it's just interfacing with the CE, SLT, Health and Safety Manager, and that's all the input from those operational staff meetings that they're having. And again, it's just as part of enhancing the governance understanding and due diligence. So, you know, if there's a mechanism around that, but it's certainly not to get down into the, you know, operational and potentially inhibit those conversations. But I think the walkarounds are a very simple thing.
Thank you. Councillor Edgar, do you want to respond?
And sometimes there's too much of a focus on our big capital projects because they're interesting and that's the ones the councils want to go and visit. But to be honest, the ones that I focus on are things like swimming pools. I've gone and watched a tree being trimmed on the side of the road. It's those sorts of places where accidents are more likely to happen than the big capital contract where everyone is very, very focused. It's bringing councils along to those pretty unsexy things to have a walk around and
Thank you. I think, you know, there's an acknowledgement of that point that you make. That's where the focus should be. And I think the other key to it is ensuring that when those visits happen, that Mr. Hughes is made aware of them, that he can report on them, so that there is a measure going on about how that is happening. So, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually just concerned we've kind of lost a focus somewhere in this charter because we are really clear that all elected members are officers as of the PCBU, and we have in previous reports acknowledged the safe work observations that have been undertaken, and we've had many conversations about the importance of elected members making sure that we meet our obligations as officers. I have no expectation that all of council will go on a safe work observation. That would be ridiculous. But I can see reporting of, for instance, in a few meetings ago last year, Councillor Noonan's done a safe work observation at Green Meadows. So just, you know, making sure that she keeps up with. Councillor McGurk's just talked about one. And we really need to be demonstrating that we are doing that to meet our obligations. So I feel we have lost something here when it shouldn't be seen as, it's not an optional extra here. This should be actually a mandatory part of meeting our obligations, and it needs to get formalised in some sense to make sure that it happens. And while it could be left on the responsibility of each elected member to harangue via 13 multiple emails, I don't think that would be the smartest move. So I think we do need to, as Councillor Eggers said, get the system in place and really get that underway. Yes, I know that requires some extra resources to do that, but actually that's about investing in the people of our organisation, the people that work for us, and I think that needs to be a top priority because that's actually, you know, why we're here, but also under legislation, that's what we have to do. So I'm just like to see that being an action point, maybe from today's meeting, to get that underway.
Thank you. Mr. Hughes will pick up on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've got some much clearer direction on where to take this, and I support the direction that's been asked for today, and it's going to be quite easy to put something in place, I think, and you know, I'll put a note here to take it to SLT on the 28th.
Thank you. I think in some ways the Mayor picks up on a point that has been quietly nagging at me, and this is in relation to sort of, I think it's appropriate that health and safety has a presence at this table, but I'm conscious that this committee reports into governance and governance then reports into council. And I'm concerned that councillors may, as a consequence of that structure, be somewhat distant. I'm talking councillors as a whole, as opposed to the councillors that may attend this meeting or while the governance meeting I know is a committee of the whole, again, there's not necessarily always councillors there. And I'm concerned, it's a new term, we review the charter at the beginning of the term. That's resulted in these changes that are here. But I think the importance here is ensuring that councillors as a whole have the awareness, the knowledge of their obligation and how the organisation is tracking to fulfil that obligation that they have. And I worry sometimes that the distance of the oversight makes that harder to keep people that far up to speed. I don't know what health and safety reporting goes through to council. I know it goes through to governance, and I sit on governance, and that's fine. But I think I'll be interested in moving forward through this term is to see how that gets reflected up at the council table as well. Madam Mayor.
Mr. Chair, look, I will assure you it's actually something that's been top of mind for me recently, and I'm actually starting to do some early thinking about the distance actually that the Audit Risk Committee has from council, and this is one of the areas that does concern me. So I'm just starting to do some early thinking about how we might address that with some structural changes that will actually see that closer connection. But just early thinking at this stage, so we can maybe continue the conversation outside the meeting.
Thank you. That's good to hear. Okay. Any further comments or discussion on the charter? Thank you for the work put into it, Malcolm, and we look forward to the next iteration and picking up on those points. But if there are no further questions on that, would somebody move, please, that we receive the report? And I'm wondering whether, does this come back here before it goes through to governance, or would we say that with those changes that have been requested now, that we move that revised health and safety governance charter through to the Governance and Finance Committee? So first of all, let's receive the report. Would somebody move that we receive the report, please? Thank you, Mr. Murray. Seconder, thank you, Councillor Edgar. Do we, all those in favour of receiving the report? Aye. Against? Carried. Councillor Edgar.
Just in consideration of the changes, perhaps we could add that the chair could sign off those changes prior to them going forward to full council. I just think there needs just that one step added. So apologies to the governance advisors. I don't have a resolution to that effect, but I think that's an important step, and we would need to add a resolution to that effect.
Okay, I'm sort of getting nods around the table to that. If people support that, and
I mean, we could possibly just add it to number 1. Approves the revised health and safety governance charter, blah blah blah, as revised.
Well, we've already received the report and voted on it. So I would stick with the
Yeah, that's the second resolution.
Oh, the second one.
Yeah, that is the second one.
So that's subject to sign off of the recommended changes by the chair.
Yeah.
The revised health and safety governance charter is recommended to Governance and Finance Committee, something to that effect. Can you do that?
The thing about the fine is it would go on to council for sign off for governance and finance, which be the final sign off, but possibly at that point you could add in that.
I think we can do it now. I mean,
Yeah, we need to.
so this is a recommendation to the Governance and Finance Committee. So I think that it is approves the revised health and safety governance charter, so subject to sign off by the chair of Audit and Risk Committee.
Yeah,
okay.
That's all we need to.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, but I think we need to.
I think that's right.
Ensure those
would you move
amendments are
that
reflected
amended?
appropriately. I'm happy to move.
Thank you. Councillor Edgar, do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Sanson, any further discussion on that? All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Sure. Let me know when you're ready and I'll come in and we'll go through it. That concludes the open section of the meeting. Would somebody please move that we go into confidential? Thank you, Councillor Edgar. Councillor Sanson, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Okay, we are in closed session.